Welcome. Have fun.
Truth decay is the term that we're using at RAND to refer to the diminishing role that facts, data, and analysis increasingly play in our political and civil discourse and our policymaking process. And we're very concerned about it, and we started a long-term initiative at RAND looking at this phenomena, trying to understand what's causing it and what we, RAND, and we as a nation can do about it. And we're aiming to do three things. First, we're aiming to be holistic and comprehensive. We're not just interested in the media, we're not just interested in politics, we're interested in how they interact and work together to cause the challenges that we're facing today. Second, we're trying to be objective. Like all RAND research projects, we come to this wanting to look at the data and the evidence and find out what's going on, not coming in with preconceived biases or ideas. And finally, we want to be nonpartisan. We want to have a rational and reasoned conversation that does not devolve into partisan arguing. So what is truth decay? Well, we defined truth decay as a system that includes 4 trends that characterize it. It has a set of causes or drivers and a set of consequences. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk through each piece of this framework for you and then tell you a little bit about what we're working on now to help work towards solutions. So first, the trends. We define truth decay as being comprised of 4 specific trends. The first is an increasing disagreement about basic facts and data and analysis of those facts and data. An example here would be the safety of vaccines or science around climate change, places where we have overwhelming bodies of evidence and yet people still refuse to accept those facts. The second and third trends go together, a blurring of the line between fact and opinion and an increasing relative volume of opinion compared to fact. And I'm sure we've all had experiences of seeing instances of these 2 trends. Anytime you go on social media or the internet or turn on the television, you're seeing facts and opinion intermingled in ways that's really difficult to disentangle. And finally, declining trust in institutions that we used to look to as sources of factual information. And this would include things like the media and the government. So the next question we asked once we had this definition is this new? Is this something that we've never seen before? Or does it just seem worse now because we have smartphones and we have so much more information available to us? So we identified 3 periods in US history that we thought shared some similarities to today. And we looked for evidence of these 4 trends. And the periods we looked at were the Gilded Age in the 1880s to 1890s, the Great Depression, late 1920s into the 1930s, and the 1960s to 1970s, or the Vietnam era. And we found evidence of 3 of those trends that I mentioned: the blurring of the line between fact and opinion, the increased relative volume of opinion compared to fact, and declining trust in institutions. So let me give you some examples. In the 1880s to 1890s, we had yellow journalism, which was basically sensationalized news stories put in newspapers to sell more papers. That should sound really familiar to everybody in this room today. We have examples from around the emergence of radio in the 1920s and 30s and around television in the 60s and 70s, where the line between what was true and what wasn't was increasingly blurred, increasingly difficult for people to distinguish. And we have periods in the 1920s and 1930s and the 60s and 70s where trust in institutions was really low. In the 60s and 70s, trust in the government, trust in the media, trust in the military was very low. So we've had these 3 trends in the past, but what does seem to be different now is this increasing disagreement about basic facts, this willingness to put aside facts. Now, people have always been skeptical, right? There's been skepticism about vaccines since vaccines existed. But what we see now is areas where we have more and more evidence and more people are becoming skeptical. So there's a divergence between the evidence we have and people's beliefs. So why is it different now? To answer that, we have to think a little bit about what's causing this phenomenon. So we identified 4 causes. Now, the first isn't something new. It's something that's always been around. It creates the palette or the foundation for this phenomenon. And that's cognitive biases in cognitive processing. There have always been characteristics of the way that humans process information that makes us more susceptible to believing things that aren't true and to then hanging on to those beliefs really firmly. And here I'm talking about things like confirmation bias. We like to be right. We get dopamine hits from being right. So when we look for information, we're guided to look for information that proves that we're right. We use heuristics and shortcuts. And we rely on our friends and family for information, which can be great if our friends and family are well informed. But if they're not, then we're not getting good information. So this creates the foundation, but this basis has been exacerbated by a number of other things that are new. And the first, most obviously, is changes in our information ecosystem. So here I'm talking about the internet, social media, and the speed and volume of information that we have now. Information travels faster, and there's more of it, and anybody can be a voice. Everybody has a platform, and that's a great thing. We should want democratized access to information. So I'm not up here saying that social media is bad or that we should move backwards, but it does bring new challenges. So do filters and algorithms that shape the way we get information. What I see when I Google something is different than what everybody else in this room Googles, because those patterns are shaped on what I've looked for in the past and what Google knows I like and what I want to see. So no one is seeing the full view of information available, and that feeds into these biases that I mentioned before. Now, the third driver has to do with education. Technology changes really fast. Institutions like schools change really slowly. So as the information environment has gotten increasingly complex and the demands of navigating that environment become increasingly difficult, schools increasingly struggle to keep up and to institute changes in the curriculum that help prepare students for those new challenges. And it's certainly not something that only students face, because adults have the similar challenges when they haven't been trained in how to navigate information, how to distinguish between what's a fact and what's not online, how to synthesize opinions, how to look for biases. All of this is different in the online environment, and we need more support to people to gain these skills. And so this gap between the skills that people need and the skills they have creates a vulnerability or susceptibility to disinformation and to a lot of the challenges that emerge from having so much unfiltered information available to us. And it's a lot more complicated addressing this educational challenge than just adding another course, because media literacy, which is what this is, requires a whole different way of thinking and interacting with information. So that's a real challenge. Now, the final driver is polarization. And here I'm not talking just about political polarization, which we've all heard a lot about, but also social, demographic, and economic polarization. We live in increasingly homogenous enclaves where we are surrounded by people who think like us, who have similar experiences and similar values and similar views of the world. And that creates both a demand and an environment in which false and misleading and biased arguments can really thrive. And that exists across the political spectrum, so it's not something that's existing only on one side or the other. So now, what are the consequences? Why should we care about this? Well, I think we have many examples, even if you just look at US history since the 1920s, of cases where policies that are made not based on data, based on something else, have led to really negative and severe outcomes. Let's just talk about economics. One of the reasons that the Great Depression was so long and so bad was because in the early 30s, economists and policymakers made decisions that ignored basic macroeconomic fundamentals. Same thing happened in the 60s and 70s. Economic decisions made in the early 60s that ignored macroeconomic data led to some of the inflation that we saw in the late 60s and early 70s. And we can look at many other examples in other non-economic areas where making decisions without data, without evidence, has led to really severe and negative consequences. But there's a whole range of other types of consequences that we think come from truth decay. And they originate with the fact that this lack of a shared understanding of a starting point, a shared set of facts and data. So when we, as a society, don't have a shared set of facts, we lose that marketplace of ideas, that civil discourse that's supposed to be the basis and foundation of democracy. How can we have meaningful discussions about important issues if we can't even agree where to start that conversation? And now that bleeds into the policy sphere. When policymakers don't have a shared starting point or a shared set of facts, it's really difficult for them to then have a more sophisticated and meaningful discussion of policy options, to weigh different priorities and to discuss pros and cons, because the whole discussion is spent trying to get to that shared set of facts. So there are many examples of cases we've seen just recently of the type of political paralysis that emerges when policymakers don't have a shared set of facts. We just came out of a 35-day government shutdown, which was driven at least partially, every shutdown has its own causes, but at least partially it was driven by the fact that our policymakers couldn't start from the same place and have a meaningful discussion then about what policies to build on top of those facts. The third consequence has to do with individuals. Individuals tend to feel checked out and alienated from the political system if they can't figure out what's true and what's not and who's telling the truth and who's not. And we've seen political efficacy measures, which is like how much I feel my vote matter, go way down over the past couple of decades. And that's concerning because it means people don't feel part of the democracy. They don't feel included. And what is a democracy if everybody doesn't feel like they're a part of it? And finally, uncertainty. And this uncertainty exists on many levels. It exists for policymakers who don't have objective benchmarks on which to make policy decisions. And it exists for individuals who don't have the facts they need to make basic decisions about buying health care or investing money. So what are we doing about it? Well, at RAND, we're approaching this as a real research question, and we've identified a complex research agenda that has 4 different pieces that we think we need to gather data on and understand better to get to better policy solutions. Now, this seems like a severe problem, a really severe challenge to our democratic institutions. And so the gut response is to want to come up with reactions and solutions right away. But if we don't have the data and the evidence to make those solutions be evidence-based, then we're just making the problem worse. So we're trying to take a pause, take a step back, to collect the empirical data and study that data that we need, to look at historical and international analogs, to understand how all these different pieces of this system that I've described to you today fit together, and then work towards responses and solutions. So what does that look like then in terms of specific projects? Well, first, we're looking at how the presentation of news information has changed over time, looking at the tone and style and the language used, using machine learning tools that allow us to analyze thousands and thousands of newspaper articles all at one time. We're doing surveys to ask people about their trust in institutions, to understand how they use media better. We're doing a project on media literacy, trying to understand what it would mean to have an effective media literacy curriculum in schools that improves student outcomes. We're doing survey experiments to understand how cognitive biases affect people's decision-making. We're looking at civic literacy. We're looking at what this means in international contexts. So we have a whole range of projects going on right now, and they'll start coming out in the next couple of months, that are going to start to dig into this phenomenon deeper and to start making recommendations. Recommendations to stakeholders that range from policymakers to tech platforms to individuals. Because this is a systemic problem, and in order to solve it, it's going to require many different solutions from many different actors across the spectrum. And so what I'll say in closing is that we're really excited about this project and we want to tell you more about it. And if you'd like any more information about this, or you'd like to get a copy of the book, my colleagues Tamara and Brandon are in the back, and if you give them a business card, they'll be happy to send you the book for free or put you on an email list so we can send you more information about the project as it emerges over the course of this year. Thank you.